So, to start off, to kind of set the stage a bit, we'll play this little clip, and then we'll try to get some responses to see how we feel. And of course, as we go through it, think of your questions, because we'll try to make sure we get to a point where everybody has, adequate time to really get a chance to chime in. Everybody has a lot to say. We're all processing things differently, and the only way we're going to get to where we get if we all do it together. So hopefully there'll be a lot of time for you guys to speak. But let's play this clip, and then let's get some responses. I'm sorry, wrong clip. And this all came together just the last few minutes, so please, we apologize.
You've been talking a lot about Israel, obviously about Ukraine. Our major problem covering Israel-Gaza right now, this phase of it, which has been going on for 6 months, is that we can't get there. It's an unprecedented situation.
Let's back it up. If we could back it up and start it one more time.
Here's the thing. You've been talking a lot about Israel, obviously about Ukraine. Our major problem covering Israel-Gaza right now, this phase of it, which has been going on for 6 months, is that we can't get there. This is an unprecedented situation. Journalists are not on the ground in Gaza. And journalists on the ground. Well, sorry, you're right. I'm talking about independent Western journalists who are not able to get it, or anybody else, except for those people who are absolutely risking their lives every single day. Media workers, journalists, almost 100 have been killed according to the CPJ in Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon in 6 months. It is an unprecedented situation. And it goes beyond the horror of what's happened to those people and their families. It's about telling the story of Gaza, telling the story of the Palestinians. Actual local journalists who tell you about a people, right? A people, not just, dehumanizing numbers or the like, but a people. And when we go to do our job, and I've been doing this pretty much since the first Gulf War, we go there to be the eyes and ears of everybody who can't vote, who's not a local, but is not able to get there.
So, a lot to unpack there. Dima, what's your response to that video?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Very excited to be with you ladies and the organizers who have been working very hard. Yeah, it's difficult to listen to this. Very difficult to listen to this. Palestinian journalists are enough. I am grateful that Israel has not let any objective, Western, perfect journalists with their makeup and their hair, protected, a bed to sleep in, food to have, drinks and staff. I'm glad Israel didn't let any of those journalists in. You know why? Because by doing that, thinking that it would suppress and silence the story of Palestinians, it actually allowed Palestinians to tell their story as human beings and not as Western journalists. Hind, name how many you all follow now. They have millions of followers. They have managed to rehumanize the Palestinian story, because we need to rehumanize the Palestinian story every time we talk about Palestine, because Palestine has been dehumanized in our brain, in our system, in every single thing we do when we talk about Palestine. The system dehumanizes Palestinians. And these 20, 25-year-olds, Plestia, you all know them, Matez, they have been showing us the story of Palestine being bombed, starved. Bisan cut her hair because she has no shampoo and no water. How much more real can it get? I would say to Christiane Amanpour, we're probably better off with our Palestinian journalists telling their story, rather than being told how they should be telling their story. So I have a little video, and I don't know if you like my t-shirt. If you like my t-shirt, I have lots of t-shirts for all of you out there. When you leave, please, out the left door, there'll be t-shirts for everybody, and I invite you to wear them, because Shireen is they're still trying to kill Shireen, because if she were dead, they would not be bulldozing the street where her memorial is in Geneva. They would not be doing everything they can to stop, the investigations from actually reaching punity and accountability. So this is the answer I'm going to give you about what Hussein Rafour said. Can you play the video, please? What we need is to protect journalists who are on the ground. And I hope every journalist in the world will demand that rather than anything else.
So, Dima, just staying with you for a second, you already mentioned Bassam Aoud, is that how you pronounce your last name?
Bassam Aoud.
Yeah, my tongue is very Americanized, I'm sorry, with my Arabic. How did you find her? How do you find your correspondence? How do you manage staffing?
I love that you're calling Bassam a correspondent.
I know,
Thank you.
I know. She has also, when I say a lifeline, I literally mean it. For all of us, and she's done incredible work. But if you could just talk a bit about what staffing has been like for you before, with AJ Plus before the last 7 months or so, and now, what does that landscape look like for you guys now?
I want to send a big, big hug to Bassam because she is very, very special.
Yeah, tell us about her.
I have to say, the story of Bassam is different because she contacted me a couple of years ago saying, hey, I'm a really good storyteller. Can I show you my work? And she showed me her work and I found her amazing. She was showing the beautiful Gaza landscape that we would not usually see of Gaza. And she was really good, so my team and Bassam started talking about how we could work together on these positive videos about Gaza. That didn't go anywhere because of many reasons, or didn't just go fast enough. And then that was with ACH24 Arabi, the newsroom in Doha. And then the genocide starts. And our ACH24 English in DC noticed Bassam on social media. I'm not aware of it. They contact her and they say, hey, would you like to file a video for us? I was not even aware they were doing it. I just saw her on ACH+ English. I was like, that's the Bassam that I talked to before, and she's on ACH+ English because she is great, because she was telling the story. So I think many organizations found themselves, media organizations found themselves kind of obliged, thanks to this ban by Israel, to use people like Bassam who are talented, who tell the story so naturally. Because they use these, social media sphere to reach millions of people, and that tells you people were waiting for the story to be told that way. There was appetite and thirst, there was need, there was a gap. There was a big hole that these journalists filled, and so people poured in and followed them in the millions. Kudos to Bassam, to Hind, to all of the journalists who are continuing to report in very dire conditions, without protection, without privilege, without any of the things that come with the perfect job of a journalist.
So we'll come back to the convergence of social media and independent filmmakers and producers that are producing content and what that means for Palestine and for movements in general. But Assia, if we can come to you. You made a film and called The Feeling of Being Watched. Maybe you could tell us your story from 2000 onwards, if you want to start even earlier, of how you got into the work that you're in as a journalist, and a little bit of your family's background, and maybe talk about surveillance and what led you to make the film.
Sure. Can I borrow this?
Oh, yeah, I was wondering.
Thank you. First of all, I'm really honored to be on this panel with Mona and Dima. I'm such big fans of your work, and it's great to be in this conversation where we can say the word Palestine openly, where we can talk openly. I mean, like, let's not take it for granted that this is a rare thing. The Feeling of Being Watched, I started making in 2013. It was a 5-year-long process. I grew up in the southwest side of Chicago in a neighborhood that Google Maps calls Little Palestine. I was born in Algiers. My background is, my family is Algerian, but we grew up Palestinian in Chicago, basically.
Wow.
And I grew up in this neighborhood, you know, we always knew we were being watched. I don't remember at what age someone told me the FBI is in the neighborhood, but it was something we grew up with. And, you know, I became a public radio journalist, and years after I started doing journalism, I started thinking, like, you know, the way I grew up was not normal. It would be really great to find out, like, what was paranoia and what really happened here? Like, what happened in this neighborhood? And so I started to investigate it, and I made a film about that investigation. I sued the FBI for the records and won 30,000 pages of surveillance records about this community. And basically what had happened was, you know, in this predominantly Palestinian community, we had raised donations in the early 90s for Palestine. One of our community members took the donations there, was arrested by Israel, and held there without charges for a very long time, and then released back to the US. In this period in the 90s, Israel was trying to make a case to the United States that our security is America's security, that actually you should be worried about the Palestinian American population in the US, and you should be monitoring them. And this is actually why the surveillance began. In the very early 90s, like a decade before 9/11, and it was around this. It grew and eventually encompassed more than just the Palestinian American community. In fact, like 40 cities across the country became enveloped in this kind of surveillance. One thing to know about making the film was, I think a lot about like censorship and like pre-censorship, about the ways that we hold back, the things that we don't say, the unspoken things that we've internalized and we know not to say, before even someone says, don't say that. And I think, and when I was making the film and when the film came out, we said, this is a Muslim community, this is an Arab community, rarely did we say this is a Palestinian community. And I keep thinking, like, did someone say that to me? Was that me? And I think it was me, actually. I think it was this unspoken thing that, you know, you can say Arab, you can say Muslim. It was the time of the Muslim ban, it was okay, but to say Palestinian is okay in certain contexts. And if you do say Palestinian, you're not allowed to say Israel. You know, like, you can talk about Palestinian Americans and the diaspora, you can talk about their, you know, the issues, but you can actually talk about, oh, that this, you know, this entire investigation was initiated by a foreign government, and America started spying on its own citizens at the behest of a foreign government, and that foreign government is Israel. That was like the, you know, the part that that we couldn't really get too much into, and yeah, so I think a lot about like what it means that actually so much of this, what we think of as the war on terror and the way it affected domestic Arab and Muslim populations began with surveillance of actually Palestinian Americans and political organizing in the US or in Palestinian communities.
So in a minute, if we could just get Assia's film trailer ready. You mentioned before the idea of truth and healing, and also being objects of information. If you could speak about that a bit before we play your trailer.
Oh, that's a lot. I think, so being objects of information, I think that okay, so in most films, most documentaries in the US, the depiction of Muslims, Arabs in general, are 90% of the depictions are either as victims of violence or perpetrators of violence. And I think often in our storytelling, we get like boxed into this empathy frame. So if we're going to tell a story, again, about this idea of humanization, we ought to humanize, you know, our people. We ought to, you know, create like an empathy for our people. And I think that actually that frame is a trap. And this is what I mean by objects of information. That frame is a trap because what's not spoken in it is the power dynamic. Who needs to empathize? Who needs to create empathy to be seen as a human? And whose humanness is taken for granted? It's just taken for granted. Do we ever have to think about creating empathy for white people? You know, and so that power dynamic is like built into it. And so, and I think that, you know, in making the feeling of being watched, I wasn't really critiquing that frame. You know, it was, you know, but like to create a film to humanize someone who is human is a problem. Like, why do we need to be humanized if we're human? You know. And so I question a lot that, like that frame, these kinds of frames of the acceptable stories, that when we can tell stories about Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims, that's the acceptable one, and it's always within that frame, and it's like, well, how do we actually break out of that frame? What does a liberatory filmmaking look like, rather than one that's based on creating empathy?
If we can roll the trailer, please, that'd be great. I think so.
We can save it to whenever.
Let's see if they have it. There it is.
Oh, the feeling of being watched.
Surprise, you're in it. So just, if you can tell us a little about Wadia Al-Fahmy and the boy that was murdered in Chicago, and you know how false narratives end up fatal.
It's still a little hard for me to talk about this, but yeah, this is the same community where in October, a 6-year-old Palestinian child was stabbed to death. And the landlord, you know, came down stairs to this child's home, and he said, right after watching, you know, network television, like he was watching the news, and he said, I see how you people are evil, you people are this, you people are that, and it turned into violence. He attacked the mom, and he attacked the child, and the child died. And like, I haven't even, I've tried to write about it and I've had a hard time, but this like confluence, this direct relationship between the dehumanizing images we see, how we're reported on, and how even children, how you can even dehumanize a child to the extent that you can, do such violence on them. It's
a boy that he even knew and played with on a number of occasions.
It's really hard to wrap my head around it. It's really hard to wrap my head around it. And I remember being, like at the funeral, like the funeral was at the mosque, at our mosque, and thousands of people came, and like we didn't have words, like no one had words. It's really hard. It's hard for me to wrap my head around it. It's just that direct, like, we've been yelling about it, I think, for a really long time, at least in documentary film, that there's a direct relationship between violence done to people and the dehumanizing images that are perpetrated, not just in films, but in the news. And this was just like a very, like raw example of it. And the violence continued, the 3 boys that were shot in Vermont for wearing keffiyehs, Palestinian boys, like the violence done on Palestinian bodies, that is barely acknowledged. If this had been done to a Jewish child or an Israeli child, like we would still be talking about it, but people have even forgotten his name, Wadia. So yeah, I think that like, and I'm like, I'm not Palestinian, and every day I feel so utterly dehumanized. Even as a storyteller, even as someone who like has the power to tell my own story and write it and define it, I feel like so small. I feel so small by the way we are seen, and we're internalizing it as adults. As even storytellers, like imagine what is happening to the rest of like the Arab American community, the Muslim American community in this country, seeing these images constantly and seeing like how our lives are treated so cheaply and devalued. It's really, really hard to watch, and it's also at the same time like the impetus to tell other kinds of stories. To say, like, we insist on our humanness. We don't need to humanize ourselves. We insist on it.
Well, in a bit, we'll come back to you and talk about what you did next with your inverse surveillance project, part 2 to the film, I guess it could be called. So, Mona, in 2019, you had a art exhibit in London, if you remember it. You've been through so many of them. But it was called Who Are You Here to See?
My God, you did the deep dive. Yeah, okay.
Tell us a little bit about it and kind of set the stage for, how you got to that place, how you chose this line of profession, how I think you either mentioned or I read where people potentially underestimated your intelligence because you had to draw out what you were thinking instead of using words, maybe. I don't know if you said it or if I read it or if I'm exaggerating it. But explain to us how you got to the field that you're in now and about that exhibit.
Okay. I moved to the US 10 years ago to work for a guy called Nate Silver. I hope most people in this room don't know his name. I hope he's going to just be confined to the dustbin of history. He was a guy who got very, very successful for predicting US election results. And because I was a data journalist, I was like, let me come and like learn from this guy who was like billed as a guru. Anyway, massive Zionist. And again, thinking of, what a surprise. And I'm thinking again about like the self-censorship that we were doing. And I don't know if other people are experiencing this, but so much of my work now has also been infused with so much of my shame about times when I felt like I couldn't speak before. So and I think it's good to actually among our community, shame is pretty prevalent. But actually, if you can mobilize that shame and turn it into something powerful, then I'm all for it. So I actually remember there was a massive uptick in Israeli attacks in Palestine while I was working there, and Nate stayed up all night to write a piece on how these dead Palestinian children might negatively affect Israel's tourist industry. No, anyway, and actually it was other editors, and I actually kind of needed Jewish white editors to take him to one side, because I couldn't be as the only, not only was I the only Arab on staff, the only Muslim, I was the only person who wasn't American, I was the only immigrant, I was the only woman who was writing, I was the only person who wasn't white in any, I was very, very marginalized. Anyway, I very quickly realized that I was going to be miserable in that job. But it had, I'm guessing there's some journalists in the room, so I also kind of want to talk about some of the actual mechanics of our industry and how it is so broken. So when I moved to the US, part of the deal was that I would sign an 18-month contract with them, and that if I broke that 18-month contract, the only way to leave it would be to pay the company $100,000. I did not have $100,000. And so I knew, even after a month of being there, this is not the place for me, but I just kind of have to wait it out. So I basically started just drawing up my desk, and it was a little bit of I'd never done illustration at all. It was a little bit of a fuck you to the people around me, because they were creating these very, very complex graphics and charts that give this veneer actually of objectivity, of neutrality. There's this veneer of precision, when actually the data that underlies them, especially if we're talking about survey data, is actually very imprecise, right? To think of one poll that has been on my mind a lot lately is this poll that's over 80% of Israelis are in full support of the genocide. And I think that number is so high that there's obviously some truth to it, but the reality is, maybe it's somewhere between 75 and 85%. Anyway, by the time you've baked that into a computer-generated graphic, it just seems like fact. So a part of creating these hand-drawn illustrations was to re-put in this idea that a human is responsible for this, a human with my own biases, whatever. Anyway, I've just been doing that for a long time, and it led to this exhibition that, I'm happy to talk about, but everything that is on my mind right now is just journalism and, everything that's been happening. I actually wanted to respond just really quickly, if it's possible, to your point on, thank God Israel isn't letting in these Western independent journalists. But also, these Western independent journalists have also been facilitating in that, they were scrambling because nobody had any correspondence in Gaza before October 7th. They didn't have anyone that they were we know a couple of fixers maybe, but no one that they would refer to as a journalist. So that mechanism was set up. And the other thing that it's just plaguing me is not only did they do that, but it was actually an active effort to discredit some of these journalists. So I think it was October 30th, the New Yorker published this piece called Hamas's Propaganda War, where they listed out all of these Palestinian journalists, including Wa'il Dahdouh, and talked about how Hamas has liked some of his work. And they also mentioned just in passing that 20 of his family members had died. But the framing of the article overall was you can't trust these Palestinian journalists. Right. So they've actively not only not had people there, but they've made an effort to discredit those Palestinian voices that are there, to treat them as if they're just amateur, Anyway, sorry, I'm ranting, but yeah. Anyway.
Well, as you go into how, your work has, been dominated by what's happening in Palestine, like most of us. Just briefly, tell us about the project where you were a contributor with the New York Times, 9 Ways to Imagine Jeff Bezos' Wealth, that you won the Pulitzer Prize for, by the way, if you guys don't know. And as important as that moment is for you in your life, and as it would for any of us, it's arguably the highest achievement for for journalists on many levels. You left crying. Tell us a little bit about what happened. Tell us about what you said at the ceremony. Tell us about what you showed to your editor when you sat next to him and you leaned in the middle of the ceremony and showed him what your next project is.
So I found out that I won in May, and the ceremony for the Pulitzers was on October 19th. I was the very last person to enter. There was one little Tiffany bag left on the table for the last person to collect. I went and sat down on a table with the president of the University of Columbia. I'm going to tell a story that I haven't. Shame. An Egyptian. But wait, I'm going to tell a story that I've actually never told before that I'm going to maybe regret. But on our table was the president of the University of Columbia, an elderly white woman, my editor at the New York Times. I come in, I sit down, and the reason why I was the last person to arrive is because I was creating this illustration, which if you can pull it up, it's the one with the purple background that's about New York Times bias. So I had been collecting data about the number of articles in the New York Times that mentioned Palestinians versus Israelis, and I contrasted that to the overall death toll of the number of Palestinians and Israelis killed. Again, this was October 19th, so it's a relatively short time frame. And the moment I sat down, I was like, did you see my Instagram? And he was like, no. And then he pulled out his phone, and you know on Instagram, you can see, he had looked. He'd looked me up, it was like the last search. I'm like, sure,
I mean, this is
whatever.
at the ceremony.
This is at the ceremony, I'm sitting there. And then I'm listening to the very first speech, and the very first speech is this, and I don't know any of these white people's names because I'm not part of that elite. Do you know what I mean? Like, I actually hate the word elite. I'm not saying that. I'm not part of that. I'm not part of that world to like know the ins and outs of who exactly these like representations of power are. But this white guy stands up and he says, you know, on October 7th, my phone was exploding, and I got this WhatsApp message over and over and over again that said, war in Israel with the Israeli flag. And already I'm thinking, that's not what my WhatsApp messages look like, but sure. And he talks about how with the war between Israel and Hamas, and at one point he talks about Israel, Gaza, but mostly Israel and Hamas, accurate reporting has never been more important. And I'm like literally shaking in my seat. And there's no speeches, you just go up, you shake your hands, you take a prize, smile for a photo, whatever. And when I went up, I like whispered in the guy's ear and I was like, oh, you made an error? And I think he just thought he'd like mispronounced my name. And I was like, I just need to go and correct it. So I went to the microphone and I just said like, I said it so badly. It was October 19th, but basically I was like, no one here is willing to say the P word. And by the way, this is institutionalized in journalism, right? We have something called style guides that tell you which language is acceptable and which language isn't. And it is in the AP style guide. You do not use the word Palestine. So you don't see that anywhere, right? Despite the fact that like, exactly, shame, shame, shame. And they're embedding it as if it's like a fact that Palestine doesn't exist. And it's so powerful. Anyway, so no one in the room, if you can't say the word Palestine, how can you report it anyway? This was the data. And then I just felt like awful. I went, sat back in my seat, watched the rest of them, cried and left. But on my way out the door, the head of the Pulitzers was like, excuse me, I just wanted to clarify, the reason why we say that is because not everyone in Gaza supports Hamas. I was like, what do you mean? What? What do you mean? Like, not everyone in Israel supports Netanyahu. I don't understand what you're saying. And he was like, well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And he was like, oh, by the way, can I just ask, are you related to Ahmed Chalabi? Ahmed Chalabi, for those who don't know, is the guy who the Americans tried to install in Iraq after 2003. I am Iraqi. And I was just like, bravo, you know, another Iraqi dude. Not a relative of mine, but well done.
Not just install in Iraq, but the one that was going to lead him to the nuclear weapons.
Yeah, he claimed that Ahmed was very clear that there were WMD, but surprise, no WMD. Right. The very last thing that I'll say is that as I went to go and get my bag, crying to just get the fuck out of there, the elderly white woman opposite me said, "Inta min wain?" And I was like, for those who don't speak Arabic, she asked me, where are you from? And I was like, Iraq, which obviously in the context of it, and she was like, oh, ana min Massoud. It was the president of Colombia's mother. And it was her way of being like, I see you. I'm sure that was her way of doing it. Like, I don't understand how that woman can sleep at night. Not white.
So you work with The Guardian now, and among other things, you have an upcoming project with Remy Youssef, which we could talk about later. But how did you get to the point where you're now, I guess, again, maybe one of the biggest moments of your career, or professional life, let's say, but you know, how did you get to that point where you were ready to use that platform to speak out and to call out your colleagues, your fellow journalists? It's a big move. Like for journalists that are here, you know, obviously this is a tricky thing to navigate. You know, how do you get to a place of power? How do you build some clout? How do you build some, you know, financial stability? And then get to a place where your conscience is going to speak louder than your pocketbook, perhaps.
So I do want to recognise the financial stability, because that is a big part of it, because I've had some years of success, which means I do feel more comfortable to say those things. That's real. Journalism really, really doesn't pay, and I've been lucky to do these projects outside of journalism in TV and film that have given me a bit more financial security. That being said, as soon as I walked into Columbia that day, you know, you see these big marble columns, there's like all these people that you wanted to work with. I can see there's Jelani Cobb across the room, blah, 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 blah. But also, I was just like, I just felt so much disgust. Like, there are people in that room who know what's happening and who aren't saying. So there are a lot of people in that room who have very clear biases. Like, I want to shift the narrative where, like, if I'm an unreliable narrator on Palestine because of the mere fact of my name, if you've done Birthright, how comes you get to be a neutral and impartial writer on this? It doesn't make sense.
And there were other journalists there protesting, wearing buttons and pins for other causes.
Exactly. For Evan, who is a writer for the Washington Post who's been imprisoned in Russia for years. Still wearing free Evan, but like, you know, forget about our colleagues in Gaza. So honestly, I did feel anxious at the time that I spoke, but I also felt really, really disgusted with the state of our industry. So it also didn't feel like a risk. Like, I'm happy to burn bridges with bad people. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll try to, again, draw on the differences of your career paths and, you know, where we are and how we try to digest where we are, and then at the same time come up with a framework of where we think journalism is going and maybe where it could go. And Dima, obviously you've been a big part of this. You know, you jumped from quote unquote hard news on the street and to online. What was that challenge for you to go strictly online? Is that something you contemplated? Was it hard to do? Was it something that you initially perhaps belittled? And then now that you see where it's at, you know, how do you continue to work on representation? I think you might have said once, as within, without, perhaps, when it comes to representation and making sure that there's access to, you know, all types of folks working within the media market?
Right, so I have actually a slide to show on representation and diversity, if you're able to put my slides. I moved online when Arab revolutions happened. It was inevitable. I was in Venezuela, I was the bureau chief for Latin America with Al Jazeera, and the only way I could be part of the Arab revolution was online. So at one point, my Twitter account was bigger than all of Al Jazeera's Twitter accounts. Because I started before Al Jazeera. And yes, it was actually a beautiful experience, because for me as an institutional journalist who was, you know, standing there out of Bolivia or China or wherever, doing the classical Arabic job, or in English, you know, being very proper, online I could be myself. I could be real. I could support a revolution. I could say really exactly how I feel. And people, you know, relate to it and interact. And it makes a difference, and you feel the impact on the spot. You see, in television, when we aired a story, it was the death of the story. That was the end of it. Online, the minute you post it is the beginning of a new life that you cannot control. And that's the beauty of it, because a story you post online can go in so many different ways, can change lives in ways you didn't even
It's not part of the 24-hour news cycle.
Right. So I remember one day, because I was quite strong about my opinions on Twitter, that I got a phone call. I admire and respect all my colleagues, but I think it was difficult for some of them to see me spending so much time on Twitter. And what's Twitter? At that time, they thought, what are these kids doing on Facebook and Twitter and the blogs? I had a blog, you know. Why is she writing a blog? She's a proper journalist, like as if writing a blog is inferior to being a journalist. Actually, on the blog, I was my complete real me. So I got a phone call one day from one of my colleagues, and he said, "You really need to stop writing politics on Twitter." And I'm like, "Why? Well, what's wrong? You know, like it's my Twitter." And this is very early on. I'm telling you, this is like 2011. This is before the discussion about whether journalists should have an opinion on social media, etc. And I remember I said, "Okay, sure, you know, I'll write about something else." And that night, Venezuela time, of course, which is very late in the Middle East, back there. I tweeted about a dish from Puglia, you know, from the south of Italy that I was cooking. It was orecchiette. I don't know if you guys like orecchiette. And I posted some music and some things. You know, I was trying to be like the well-behaved person on Twitter that they wanted me to be. And then, slowly I moved into the moon. I said, oh, the moon is crying over Syria and Yemen and stuff. And it took 4 tweets for me to go back. But I went through the kitchen, music, poetry, the moon, and everything else. And nothing happened. The Director General of Al Jazeera comes to Washington, D.C. for a regional meeting, and I fly from Caracas to D.C. And I arrive late because, planes out of Venezuela are always late. So I arrive late, and he sees me across the room. His name is Wadah Anfar. Many of you might be familiar with him. And he's speaking to everybody. He stops and he's like, oh, look who's here, the queen of Twitter. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes in the beginning it takes you doing some pushing. And then, because of my presence online, Al Jazeera thought I would be the right person to work on AG+. That's
right.
So, that transformation actually gave me new opportunities in my career that I would have never envisaged before. My dream after Latin America was to go to Africa, because I had done Asia, I had done Europe, I had done the Arab region, I wanted to go to Africa. But Arab Revolution really changed, I think in everybody's life, changed the way we were seeing things. So, do we have the presentation? I want to show you how important our presentation is. I can't see the screen, gosh. I can
Describe it again, maybe they can find it as you describe it.
There is a picture of lots of journalists from the newsroom. Okay, keep going. Can you, do I have a clicker? Oh, I do, sorry. Mm-hmm. I'm supposed to be doing this. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So, meet some of our AG+ journalists, not just from Palestine, from all over the world from Palestine. So I want to, because I feel dizzy if I look up. Allow me.
Yeah, of course.
So diversity means that you have to have Palestinians in your newsroom, but not just any Palestinians. All kinds of Palestinians. Mm-hmm. It's not enough to have one Palestinian from the West Bank. For example, on the left here, Iman is from the West Bank. Ilya is from the West Bank, but Iman left the West Bank early on. Ilya came straight from the West Bank to work for us. It's not the same thing. So Iman experienced living outside of Palestine. Ilya is fresh, 100% Palestinian. Then you have Ayman. Ayman is a video editor from Gaza. And Ayman lost part of his family while he's working on the coverage in Gaza. You have a real person from Gaza who is actually going through the genocide, through blood, feeling. That's not the same as a video editor who's dropped from somewhere else. It will make a difference in your story. It will make a difference in the discussions in the newsroom. And then you have Dina Takruri. Of course you know Dina Takruri. So Dina is Palestinian American, and she has done something incredible on AG+ that I invite all media organizations to try, to tell the personal story. She went back to Hebron, where her father was born, and she tried to understand the reality of Hebron through her own story and told it. And she won a Peabody for it. Palestinian story won a Peabody for it. And then you have Khalid, who's on his way. Now he's in Istanbul. He's about to sail on the Free Gaza Flotilla. Khalid is Palestinian Spanish, and he works for ACH24 Español in Mexico. We just flew him from Mexico to Istanbul to go on the Free Gaza Flotilla. So that's another dimension of a Palestinian who's European Palestinian, but very much Palestinian at heart. Then you have, then you have Haifa Nusayba. She's from Jerusalem. She has to go back every now and then to Jerusalem not to lose her residency. She's constantly worried about losing the only identity she has. The only way she can go back home, because Jerusalemites don't have Palestinian Authority passports. They don't have Israeli passports either. They have a Jordanian travel document that is temporary and only issued if you are from Jerusalem, and she has to renew her residency when she's actually born. She's from Jerusalem. She's always worried about that. She's living the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem in our newsroom. And then you have Richard. He is Colombian Palestinian. He works for ACH24 Español, and he showed up at one of these talks I was giving in Qatar. He said hello, and I love this vibe. And I'm like, are you a journalist? Like, no, I'm a translator. I'm like, can you come visit us? Because I really think we could do with somebody like you. He does all the reversioning of stories from ACH+ Arabic into Spanish with his Colombian Palestinian heritage. He went to Palestine for the first time when he was in his 30s to meet the family that he didn't know about in Palestine, that his father had a whole family, like with kids, but left to Colombia and married his mother. Fascinating story. And he speaks perfect Arabic. He studied Arabic for a long time. And then you have Hassan Manasra. He is one of our senior graphic designers. He's an amazing artist. So he's Palestinian, deprived from going back to Palestine because his parents are from 1948, Nakba. You know, they're survivors of the Nakba. So he's never been to Palestine. He's lived all his life in Jordan and now in Qatar. And finally, Leila Abdo from Nazareth. So she comes from the heart, and she's actually lost now her citizenship rights because she's been out of Nazareth for a long time. So she holds an Israeli passport that she may not be able to renew because she is working for us. She has a great show. I invite you all to watch it in Arabic. It's called Shukalu Bil Ibri, where we talk about what Israelis are saying in Hebrew about Gaza, which is an incredible, insightful experience for us. Because, look, none of the other Palestinians would have been able to do the job that she's doing because she speaks perfect Hebrew. She knows the Israeli society inside out. So you see that kind of diversity? That's what you need to have in a newsroom to really tell the Palestinian story. Now, on top of that, we have the editorial manager of AJ+ English, who is a Jewish South African anti-Zionist. An incredible Tony Karen, look him up, Anthony Karen. He writes in The Nation, he writes in a lot of places, and he's been in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. I learned from him as a Palestinian every day, to be honest. It's incredible to have the privilege of having such people. So, and on top of that, we have Bisan in Gaza, we have Faten Alwan in West Bank, who is our correspondent. This is the kind of diversity you need to have, not just for Palestine, for every story you cover. And I have to tell you, our AJ+ is diverse in that sense, even for Iraq. We have Kurds, we have Arabs, we have Christians. For Morocco, we have Amazigh, we have Arab, we have, we really work on diversity, and we are 50% female, male leadership and decision-making positions, as well as employees.
Can I just make one really quick follow-up point to that? We all obviously want to be supporting Palestinian journalists. I feel like that's been a through line. You can also, I know so many of our donations feel really, really futile right now, but there is the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate that is taking donations. And the reason why I mention them is also what you were saying. I've been thinking about historic cases where Arab charities, Muslim charities have been redesignated as terrorist organizations, right? So after I donated to the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate, there was a white journalist that I had been working with. He interviewed me for this show and was absolutely terrible. And he apologized to me afterwards, and I was like, you need to make a donation. Don't apologize, make a donation. And that's pure strategy, because it means that if they redesignate it as a terrorist organization, he's gonna have to fight with us, because his name is gonna be on that list too. So honestly, like,
that's brilliant.
So like, all these organizations that you're donating to, get your white ally friends who like kind of say the right thing, but to actually like be in it with us. That's so that their names are on those same lists.
And Mona, you're not just... And you're not just talking. I mean, you won $15,000 for the Pulitzer Prize, and you donated all of it to the syndicate. Is that correct?
I did, yeah, but I didn't want it. I really didn't want it. Like, even when you're clapping about the prize, it means nothing to me. Like, it means absolutely nothing to me. Those people don't have morals. it literally means nothing. I've even like the actual prize itself is like buried in the back of my closet. I don't even want to look at it. I don't care. Yeah.
And as we go to some follow-up questions to kind of again, draw on the parallels between everybody, just real quick, Dima, are you still the only female executive within the Al Jazeera network?
Yeah, I'm still the only managing director of a channel in Al Jazeera network. Yes. Yes. I have to say I've spent my whole life being the only woman in the room. It gets tiring. Really. I was the first female bureau chief. I was the first female senior producer on the desk when we covered Iraq. And Jihan was there. Where's Jihan? She did Control Room. You have to watch Control Room. You haven't. That's a lesson on Iraq. It gets tiring to be that. But yes, I mean, you need to keep trying. I mean, what we did in AJ Plus with the diversity of female male came organically. It was not quota. That's because if you give equal opportunities to people, they will grow. And when they grow, the people who are sitting back, not usually growing, they feel they need to work harder. So they work harder. So you have everybody working harder. So I think it's a natural, the natural growth of people is much better for me than if I would have imposed, a quota of 50-50. It's just grew beautifully because, yeah, people are smart and they deserve growth.
Real quick, how much time do we have left for questions?
No.
10 more minutes before we get to questions? We should start questions.
Yeah.
Okay. The one thing I was going to pose to you guys, but we can do it through questions, is that if we can try to draw on the parallels of movements, of the way other issues have been covered, from Black Lives Matter to Standing Rock to things in the global South, and just how we see things playing out from surveillance to the data points. I think you said what you like to do, Mona, is to see where the deviating data is to help discover what you need to pinpoint and focus on. But we can try to get to that through the questions, because I'm sure a lot of people have things that they want to ask. So there's a mic here in the middle. I probably should have said that earlier. If anybody wants to approach it now, and we'll try to go through them as quick as possible. Maybe try to keep your questions brief as possible. And if you want to direct it to a particular person or to the entire panel, just make sure you indicate that. And then let's see how many people we can get through. All right, so the first person is up. Yes, how you doing?
Are we going to do a bunch?
She directed it to Mona, but I think if anybody wants to answer this, that's fine.
No, that's okay. I actually don't know any. I'm really sorry, but no, I don't. Does anyone else? I actually think, oh my God.
I'd like to talk to you afterwards. I might be able to connect you with a few folks. Yes. But did you want to say something, Dion, to that?
No, I'm asking if we're going to answer each question at a time or here all
yeah, depending if they direct
I can only remember the name of the woman that runs it. Minna Atalla in London, MYRNA, and then her last name is ATALLA. I really can't remember the name of the organisation. I actually briefly worked there. Anyway, they do workshops in Palestine, including art therapy for children. That's okay.
Make sure to approach us afterwards as well. Okay. Hi, welcome.
Hi, my name is Lena. So I'm Palestinian, I'm from Palestine 48, and I'm so happy that I saw that there is representation, because when I came here like 7 years ago, I was so shocked that there's so much lack of representation of Palestinians 48 in the US. And a lot of people think we're like, maybe not Palestinian, we don't associate with Palestinians, we are Palestinians, I do identify as Palestinian. But what people don't know is that my family lives in Haifa, and if I like or share or post anything about Palestine or Gaza, if I go to see my family in Haifa, I will be taken to jail from the airport, and they will not care, no one will ask about me. Same thing for my family. My dad is a political science professor in Haifa. If he says anything, he gets letters telling him you're taken to jail. So it's not that we don't want to represent, it's just because we're very restricted, and we kind of need you guys to represent us and talk more about us. And I don't know, my question is, why is this lack of representation of Palestinians 48? How can we help them more? How can we represent them more and really show our struggle there without being affected negatively?
Right. I'll be happy to say that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. First of all, it's a very good point about language. I've heard Palestinians from I've heard Arabs of 1948, Arabs of Israel. What's Arabs of Israel? And I'm like, what is that? Like, Israeli Jews cannot be Arab? All Palestinians are Arab? I'm very confused, right? They're called Palestinians. It's very easy. I think that's the first step, is to normalize the word Palestinians about Palestinians who actually stayed and managed to stay on their land and were not ethnically cleansed. And many people, unfortunately, don't know about those Palestinians. And yes, you are right, they're underrepresented, but that's because they have no access to the Arab world because of politics. They cannot come to work in most Arab countries. They have access to the rest of the world, but not to the Arab world. And the Arab world is not aware, I think now it's becoming more aware, that they exist, how they exist. So yeah, it's your hard work, my hard work, everybody's hard work to make them become more visible. And I want to read something that Robert Fisk said once about journalistic cowardice, when we don't call things the way they're supposed to be called. So when we don't call Palestine, Palestine, we call Palestinian territories, right? Or when we say, for example, let me tell you some other things that are said. Sorry, I can't see, I'm too old to see with my glasses. Yeah, they say the Palestinians, not the Palestinian people, right? Look at the media, they say always the Palestinians. It's like they're a random group of people. They're just there. And now recently, it's all Gazans. Palestinians don't exist in Gaza. They're all Gazans. They all claim they die in some airstrikes, right? Some explosions. So language matters, and I want to read this from Robert Fisk. Through journalistic cowardice and laziness, we make it easier for those who suffer to become the aggressors and those who are occupiers to become the victims.
And just quickly on the Gazans thing, it's also a very effective way of erasing the violence that is currently happening in the West Bank that so few people are reporting on as well.
Absolutely.
I think back to the idea of censorship and the words that we say and the words that we don't say. There's the style guide, that says don't say Palestine, but recently there was this leaked memo from the New York Times about the very long list of words they don't say: occupation, apartheid, refugee camp,
genocide.
Genocide. Like all of these list of words, and I just want to big up Writers Against the War on Gaza for really naming those things, because it's very important. Not just to say the things that we're not supposed to say or say the words we're not supposed to say, but to name them. Yeah. To name why we're not saying them, why we say Arab Israeli instead of Palestinian,
Yeah, and they used to say the war in Iraq.
Right.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
They're like, wait, hold on, it's not E-R-I-O, okay? Changes a whole history, right?
And also, not only the words that they're not using, there's a slide somewhere in the deck, which is the AP's definition of Zionism, which, if I can remember off the top of my head, it's something like the Jewish people's peaceful effort to reclaim their biblical homeland is the AP's definition of Zionism. Wow. So it's stating it as fact to reclaim their biblical homelands. And that's what journalists, and by the way, again, I want to also just really, really briefly talk about how mundane some of these mechanisms are. Evil also works in really mundane ways. So for example, in the New York Times, they just laid off a bunch of, they sold off part of their sports section. So all of the people who used to be sports editors got placed to edit the live blog on Israel and Palestine. These people who have no fucking understanding of anything to do with what's happening now. And so, what do these editors do? They pull up the style guide. Oh, okay, some writing was sent to me. Okay, I need to edit the writing. What does the word Zionism mean? It's also mundane. It's not just that there's Zionists that are working on it. It's, anyway.
Next person. Yeah.
Hello, my name is I'm not a man. I'm also from Arab 48, born and raised. Here representing the Education Organization, which is an organization supporting Palestinian education. My question is, and as you all were talking and I was trying my own conclusion and contextualizing, I wish I wrote the way I thought, obsessively, with imagining hunger. I would write to the point of supplication about you, about us, about home, about Palestine, which I think in many ways summarized and encapsulated a lot of what you're saying. And I think Muna, you kind of raised a really interesting framing about the mechanics of the industry, the mechanics of journalism. As storytellers, which is that's how I see you, as someone who consumes Chalabi and someone who also speaks fluent Hebrew. What are the mechanics of storytelling in a world that constantly is silencing Palestinian voices and the affiliates of Palestinian voices for our stories to scale up and reach spaces where they're constantly pushed down?
I mean, the one good thing is I feel like it's happening. It is actually happening. I never, ever thought that we would be here. Like, the conversations that I'm hearing are also nothing like what I imagined 10 years ago in my life, which is also really bizarre. I was having a conversation with a producer in a very, very, very respectable place, and she was explaining to me, like, everything's gotten really lawless in Gaza. And I was like, okay. Like, obviously, your back gets up, you're like, are you describing people as savages? And she's like, no, because of Hamas. And again, my back is up. I'm assuming that she's saying Hamas is making things worse. And this really senior producer was like, no, I'm saying, because Hamas can't effectively govern, there's a lot of lawlessness right now. I was like, what am I hearing? So anyway, things are changing. I think it's actually a lot of what Dr. Mads was saying in the first panel as well. It's about listening to Palestinians, only like contributing when we are actively invited to speak with them, like rather than on behalf of them. Yeah, I don't really know how to say it more than that, other than like have lots of like, I'm also thinking about having everything be on the record, right? So even if you're having difficult conversations with editors and stuff, put it down in writing. Make it so that it's a little bit difficult for them to respond with a no, which they can always do in person. So again, my editor at the New York Times sat me down in November and said face to face, we won't work with you anymore. And so my thing was to write to them the following day and say, like, summarize the exact conversation, saying, you didn't say that my critiques of the New York Times are factually false. You didn't say that my critiques are unfair. Therefore, all you are doing is punishing me. And I thought he would reply being like, that wasn't our conversation that we had face to face. And he was like, unfortunately, that's our position. And I have that on the record now. Wow. And that's good. Like, I want that in writing. Yeah, I don't know. They're always going to claim that like it's in our heads or something. Put everything down in writing. I don't know.
Let's go to a couple questions over here. Thank you.
My question's for Assia. I'm really looking forward to watching you when I run up and do that. But my question is about whether you were looking at a specific model that had been done before, it's similar to the work that you did with your investigation, and how you worked collaboratively with the team, making a visit for your community that would be able to understand the needs and interests as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Actually, I think the process of making a documentary film, before that I was in public radio, and the process of making the doc film was like actually unlearning a lot of journalism school baggage and letting some of that stuff go, things that I hadn't named before. So for example, like point of view, like in film, point of view is respected and valued and actually enriches a story. And we're taught in journalism this idea of objectivity, which has been critiqued, like a lot. But like this idea that like, actually what the critique against POV in journalism is that like whiteness is zero and everything else is a deviation from that. So it's like, this critique against, during the movement for Black Lives, of Black journalists covering the movement, people were saying, oh no, you're, like this is bias. They were getting a lot of heat from editors and they pushed back and said like, actually it is a value to be able to cover your community and to see things from the inside and to talk about them. And so there, to go back to that, like there have been movements where journalists of color have like shine a light on a thing that we had accepted and had not named before. And it's like, whiteness is not not a vantage point.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
like actually it is very much a vantage point. It's a very colonial gaze on these communities. This idea that you have to be really far from the people you're covering
To
tell the truth about them
Yeah,
is
yeah.
purely a colonial concept, right?
Yeah.
And so I started making the film. For the first 2 years, I was like doing it like a journalist, like interviewing people, asking them questions I already knew the answers to. And I think it was like, it was comfortable that way, to like have an arm's distance and point the mic at other people. And 2 years into the film, I realized the only way I can do it is to make this a personal story. And so, and people said, you know, this either is investigative journalism or it's a personal story, but we managed somehow to do both. And that was actually the most honest way to tell that story. Like, to be truthful is to be transparent and not to pretend that you're objective and you have no vantage point or you have no point of view. And I also realized that the best way to tell the story is not from bringing people that parachute in and get airlifted out, but people that have a stake in the community. And so our team and our crew were all women of color, actually, most of them from Chicago. And that was really powerful because you can't tell the story about surveillance and then bring like a white cameraman with a camera into like the Muslim community. And people are like, what, are you surveilling us? So a lot of things like I had to like unlearn and name, and I think that was really powerful to put words to them and say, oh, that's why I'm doing this, or this is why I'm afraid of being a part of the story, that they're gonna say I'm not objective, or, you know, and I let those things go, and I think I made a much more honest film when I did that.
May I add, you know, this concept of the view from nowhere.
Yeah.
It's a gatekeeper of colonial supremacy. The view from nowhere means it suits the people in power. It suits the news agencies that actually feed the whole world the story from the perspective of Paris, London, Washington, D.C., Madrid, and Rome. That's the view from nowhere. It's the view from the person who's had power and who's sitting on a chair and doesn't want anything changed. So instead of objectivity as it's given to us through standard Western mainstream, call it whatever you want, I think we should strive for accuracy, fairness, and transparency. And be objective by being truthful. But we can never be 100% objective.
Of course
We're
not.
all subjective. When I stand in Bolivia and listen to Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia in 2,000 years, and there's somebody from the New York Times or France 24 or whatever other place, it doesn't feel the same. I'm Palestinian. My heart beats. And they are sitting saying, is he going to be democratic enough? Does he actually speak good Spanish? Well, he doesn't need to speak good Spanish. He's from this land, and the language of this land is not Spanish. It's his language. It's you. You know, with your expectations of what the leader of Bolivia should be like.
Right.
That is called objectivity. When I got excited, it's called like, I'm subjective. Yes, we are subjective, but we can be professional and honest.
Yeah.
So we're just going to take 2 more questions. No more. Actually, I'm getting waved off. But I know you guys have been standing, so I don't think we're in a hurry afterwards, are we? So we could be outside, and I implore you guys to come and speak to them afterwards. And the things that we didn't mention, if we could just do it in 30 seconds real quick. Obviously, if you get a chance, and if you haven't yet, to watch Assia's film, Feeling of Being Watched, please check it out. And we want to ask her about her part 2 of that, Inverse of Surveillance Project. So if anybody's outside, we'll talk about it. And then Mona, if you have time, maybe she can just say something real quick outside also about her upcoming project with this actor, comedian that you guys all know about, that does this show that you can't show to your parents. But we'd love to hear about that. And then of course, if you don't subscribe and haven't subscribed to AJ+, you know, and if you don't know what it means, which I don't think I have to say it, please subscribe. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys to the organizers.